Jackson here from NFL Red Zone. I hope you're checking out 1 hour of 5-Yard Rush, one of the best podcasts on NFL football in the UK.
Hello and welcome back to the Flagship show. No Dan this week. Unfortunately, we had to move to Tuesday this week, but Dan will be back next week. So it's me, but don't worry, as always, I'm not alone. I have an amazing guest. And also, just as a reminder that the Dynasty show starts in a little over an hour. So we're the warm-up act to the real stars of the 5-Yard Rush Network. So do make sure you stay on after this show and check out all the great work that the boys are doing over there, because it's just amazing content by Liam and Rich, what they're producing with the draft and rookies, etc. So make sure you do that. But like I said, got an amazing guest with me, really good friend of mine. So glad that we could get him back on. He is the king of the auction. He is the lawyer, fantasy football lawyer extraordinaire. He writes for Football Guys. He has an amazing podcast called The Auction Brief. And he's just overall one of the nicest guys that you'll ever have the pleasure of interacting with on Twitter. And I know a lot of our followers who joined in last year really made the most of interacting with him. And I know he did a great job. So Drew Davenport of Football Guys and The Auction Brief, thank you so much for coming back. How are you, my man?
I'm doing great. That's quite an introduction. Thank you. I counted like 3 amazings in there. I'm going to have to see if my wife can work more like amazing into our conversations on a daily basis.
I'll tell you what, if she doesn't, download WhatsApp. I'll send you a daily voice note with telling you how amazing you are. You
that sounds great. That. I need more amazing in my life. Thanks for having me, man. This is cool.
No. It's great to have you. Now, I kind of want to, before we get into a little bit about what you've been up to, I just want to say we're going to kind of evolve this. You were on last year. I think the episode was May 31st, June 1st. Make sure you check it out, because we're not going to rehash old ground. What we want to do is establish auction play, especially in the UK. It's something that's been around a lot of years, but there hasn't been a lot of content and a lot of drive to play it. It's still quite a small percentage of people play it. However, I noticed that when we did this episode a year ago, loads of amazing feedback. One of the most talked about episodes of last year. So go back and listen to that episode as a precursor to this. Make sure you listen to Drew's podcast, which we're going to mention in a minute as well. But I just want to caveat that if you are listening as an extension and you missed that first part, make sure you go back and listen to that after this one, because there's a lot of great content in there. But how's things? Like I said, it's been almost a year since you've been on. What have you been up to other than crushing poker and more auction tournaments and another King's Classic belt?
Yeah, gosh, the King's Classic thing is wild, man. I have very few times gone back to back at a fantasy league in general. To go back to back in King's Classic was one of the highlights of my life. Like I can't believe I'm saying that out loud. And I say one of the highlights. That doesn't mean it passed, my wedding day or my kids or whatever. But that was awesome. I consider myself extremely fortunate to have done that. That takes a lot of luck and a lot of things to line up, as you know. But, just trying to keep pushing the auction stuff. And I realized that there's just so much legal stuff coming out all the time. These threads are great but 20% of the world or something like that's on Twitter. So I decided to take my talents to TikTok and see if that's going to work. I don't know how that's going to go, but if you want to check out some of the legal stuff that's happening, it's a much more fluid, easy way for me to talk to people about what's going on with legal stuff. So I've been starting that up, and we'll see how that goes. In a bit of a lull right now, but getting ramped up to the season.
Well, that's it. And the TikTok channel is so good. Now, this is how good it is. I refuse to do TikTok. I'm just one of these people that tend to be a late adopter to certain things. I was a late adopter to Twitter. I was a late adopter to Instagram. TikTok was always going to be something I was probably even never going to do, or because I always find the dances and all that annoying. you did your thread, and I was like, right, well, if you're going to be on TikTok, I'm going to be on TikTok. So I literally have created a TikTok account just to watch your video. I might occasionally post some content. I don't know. I'm certainly not at the moment thinking about it, but that's how good the content is that Drew puts out, because the thread you put out about Alvin Kamara, and we'll get to that in a minute, was it really made me stop and think, because we'll talk about it in a minute, but it's really made me hit the pause button a little bit on some of the things I was doing with him.
Yeah. Thanks, man. That's quite a compliment that you signed up for TikTok for me. But yeah, I just found that like I was putting out these huge threads and people like them, don't get me wrong, but like, 30 tweet threads or whatever. I'm like, I can do a couple minutes on TikTok and hit so much more, because there's a lot of nuance to some of this stuff that you just can't hit in a thread. And also, I know it seems like fence sitting a little bit, but sometimes when you have a situation, you're like, all right, this could happen or this could happen. And sometimes you can't always make the call, but you want to put the options out there so at least people can hear that and say, all right, I believe in this or I believe in that, and they can act based on that.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, it's a fluid situation, isn't it? We talk about the Sean Watson situation. That's, you wrote a huge thread over and over again about Sean Watson because it was a fluid situation. And okay, that situation seems to be coming to a conclusion from a legal standpoint. It's still not over. There's still, cases to settle and civil stuff, but the criminal side seems to be, at least at this moment, settled. So it's just one of those things, isn't it? You're never going to be, you're not the lawyer of the case. You don't have all the facts. You can only take what's in the public domain. And I think that's what you do, is you kind of take that, what's out there, you condense it into what's true and extrapolate all the noise and all the stuff that doesn't matter. And you take out the conjecture. You kind of just give an informed opinion, which is what people want. And that's why those threads are so popular. But I look forward to the TikToks as well, because I think
there
it's
will
going to
be
be
no
great stuff.
Dancing.
Good. The second you do a proper dance, the only time I allow a dance is a victory dance, either if you win a lot of money at poker or you win another King's Classic belt. If you win 3 in a row, you're definitely allowed to do some form of dance.
Yeah, it's going to be mandatory at that point. I'll have to do
it. Yeah, I think so. But yeah, it's a phenomenal achievement. I mean, you have in your King's Classic league, you have some big hitters. The reason we talk about it is because it's such a, I mean, you're talking about, how many people are in it now? It's got 48. So it's 48 people in total.
It's a 14 teamer now. It used to be 12.
42.
But now it's 14. So it's 20. There's 42, I believe, total, because there's an online division now. So there's 2 that draft at the Hall of Fame and then 1 online division with some international folks.
Yeah, which I'm lucky enough and blessed enough to be in, and Stocks and I were very close to taking the snake draft. There's 2 different leagues in each league, so you do a snake and an auction, and Stocks and I got pipped in the final to good friends of ours, Kirk Holloway from South Africa and Peter Gent of Germany. So they're officially the first ever international winners of a belt, which is annoying, but it was an all-international final. So at least, the international players are starting to stand up and be represented. But it was, to be honest, it was a tough league because I don't know. Is Tags in your was Tags in your division, or was he?
He was, yeah.
So Tags was in your division, and then he came to our division because of the COVID, and he couldn't make the event. He couldn't make the King's Classic because of the fact that he had COVID, and then obviously lost that battle to COVID, and it was a really difficult situation for everyone. Bob, who organised the King Classic, Bob Lund, did an amazing job with donating a lot of money to the cause and to the family.
Yeah, Tags was in our division. Marcus Grant. We had a couple new additions this past year because of COVID and because some people didn't want to make the trip, which I understood. But guys like Chris Allen and Mike Woolert, Ryan McDowell, Darren Armani, Brian Drake and Steve Rappin, Doug Orth, Matt Donnelly, Mauricio Gutierrez. Those are some of the guys. Scott Pianowski was in there last year. that is one tough customer.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So Mauricio and Matt were in my division last year, but then because they were able to go, that's where some of the shuffling was. So tags came out, and that was going to be a temporary, I think, one-off swap for COVID. But I don't know what's going to happen going forward. But
you know what, Murf, let me say real quick, this is what I love about you. You have this very mild-mannered personality, but I can tell that you were kind of hacked off. You didn't get to be called the first international winner, and I love that because I know there's some competitiveness there that you don't let it out of the cage very much. But I saw it when you said, yeah, that was kind of annoying. But anyway, congrats to him. I love it.
Yeah,
it's great.
That is very much me to a T. I'm always I'm one of those guys. If they pan to the Oscars and I didn't win, I'd be the guy that you'd sort of see Joey in the Friends episode at first, and then I'd remember and go like, "Oh yeah, great." And when time's a great healer. No, I am a very competitive. If you weren't competitive, I don't know why you'd be playing.
I agree.
So I do get cheesed off when I don't win. But having said that, I'm always grateful if I lose to good people. If I lose to someone I hate, or it's real jerk,
that's worse. Yes,
that's a lot worse. Yeah. Luckily, that doesn't happen too often. Let's just touch upon. We'll get into the auction stuff in just a second. Let's touch upon Alvin Kamara because, as I said, you released this video on TikTok this past weekend, and like I said, it stopped me dead in my tracks because for my lack of really delving into the situation, I just thought, okay, it was a nightclub brawl. He was arrested. No real charges seem to have been sort of filed. There's no court date. It's not really being talked about in the media. Nothing seems to be, it's not like what happened when Tyreek Hill had his offense or Kareem Hunt or all of these things. You just think, okay, it's just one of those incidents. If there was a video, it was probably going to come out by now. It hasn't. It seems like something that's just going to get swept under the carpet. He maybe gets a small ban, but it's not going to be anything tragic. But you are a lot more enlightened than I am, my friend. And that's not the case, is it?
Well, it can feel like they're trying to sweep it under the rug because things take a little while. But the one thing I did say in that video is that this is a felony charge now. So felony level stuff over here. And I know that, so we've got a little bit of translation to do here because I know that a lot of your audience is over in the UK. Essentially, the most serious criminal charge is a felony, and then the less serious charges are called misdemeanors. So the felony charges is what you really have to be aware of because the charge that they've got, which is called battery with substantial physical harm, is because they broke this guy's orbital bone and it elevated it to a felony charge. The problem with that is there's mandatory prison time if you're convicted of that charge. Now, I'm not saying that he's going to be because it doesn't look like he has any prior history. He's also charged with a misdemeanor because there were 3 other people there. And the misdemeanor part of it is called conspiracy to commit battery. So just because there was a group of people. And I would guess that at some point it'll be pled down to something like a misdemeanor. So it's a little bit lower charge. But the one thing that I always tell people is, without getting lost in the weeds, if you pull back to like a 30,000 foot view and you say, well, what's going on with the case? The main thing that I said in my video that I'm still concerned about is this video. We don't know whether it's going to be released or not. We may never see that. That video may never see the light of day. Then again, it may get leaked. And if it does, the one thing I always say is you can count on the NFL to protect itself when it comes to their image. So they may think something different. And that's exactly what happened with Ray Rice, and same thing with Kareem Hunt. As soon as we knew what happened, but as soon as the video evidence of what happened came out, that's when the NFL stood up and did something. And that's when teams rushed to sort of protect themselves and their image. So that's the 30,000 foot view. Hey, if this video comes out, how outraged are they going to be? And what are they going to do to Alvin Kamara when and if it does come out?
Yeah. And so for someone who was rising in ADP. He went from ADP 18 to ADP 9 pre-start of the league year to just last week. So he was someone who, okay, Jameis Winston's gone in, and they signed Andy Dalton. So that took away the risk of Taysom Hill being anywhere near the football from a quarterback standpoint, and therefore was going to allow Kamara to see a return and an upside potential. So, and I expect his price would have continued to rise. But I think with what you're saying is it's probably not wise to spend the first round pick on a guy who could be released. If that video goes, the history of this is Kareem Hunt. He got released, and the Saints, and they don't have, if it was Sean Payton still there, I would say maybe they try and ride it out. Sean Payton's been there forever and a day. He's got the reputation to where he could probably ride it out because he's won a Super Bowl there, and you get a bit of extra credence and time when you've earned a level of respect. Dennis Allen is a new head coach, and all right, he's not a new head coach because it's his second time and he's been there a long time, but he's not going to be able, he doesn't have that capital to be able to do anything other than cut him. It's going to be very, very difficult for them if a video comes out to hold on to him.
It is. And the problem from our perspective is we don't know when that other shoe is going to drop. And so what's funny is I made a video end of last week or this weekend about Kamara. And then I said, hey, look, there's a court date on Monday, which was yesterday. And I said, when that court date happens, things might change. And they did. And that's the problem with this case, because every time something new happens, I'm going to probably change my opinion. And I know a lot of people say like, oh, well, you were saying this and now you're saying this. And it's like, well, yeah, I got new information. I mean, isn't that what you want from me? You want me to adjust when I get new information. And here's the thing. On Monday, they continued the case until August. And not only did they put it off to August, but it's not like set for trial or something in August. It's still a pre-trial phase, which means that in August, if they ask for a trial, that could push it back into the season. And then, like I said in my video, that it doesn't take a genius to figure out that one more continuance may push it past the NFL season altogether. Now, we don't know any of that. That's the problem. We don't know exactly. Maybe they come in August and they have a deal and it's all set up and he pleads to a misdemeanor and they suspend him for 2 to 4 games and, hey, he's playing by October. But we just don't know that. And that's the real problem here. That's the uncertainty and the volatility, especially as we sit here in April. Man, it's really hard to put much draft capital in this guy. And the last thing I'd say is, my first video talked about how I was concerned about 2022. And if this video came out, how many games he would get, like he might not play at all in 2022. Now my concern has shifted a little bit more towards 2023. And that's like, if you're talking dynasty versus redraft, as we get closer to the season, if nothing big drops, if this video isn't out, and if they haven't settled the case, maybe you feel a little bit better about redraft. But that's in a couple months. I'm not going to feel comfortable about that until we get a little closer to the season. But as far as dynasty goes, then you're talking about 2023. Because if they resolve it after the season, and if something big comes out, or if he's forced to plead to a felony, Antonio Brown got 8 games. He didn't even injure the guy. He pled guilty on a felony battery type charge in Florida. He didn't even injure this person and got 8 games. If this dude's got a broken orbital bone and the report says that Kamara was hitting him after he was unconscious on the ground, man, I think 8 games is a starting point. So the volatility is just off the charts with Kamara right now.
Yeah, and I think it's very difficult to, again, judge what's going to happen. And so, at this stage of the season, there aren't many people doing a startup redraft league. So, there is some time here, but in Dynasty, it's something to think about. If you get a decent offer for a player who is, how old is Alvin Kamara now? 27, 28? We're not talking about a player who at the running back position is going to be around for the next 5 years. We're talking about a player who has 2-3 years of elite production left, max. And if he's going to be under threat of missing time in one of those seasons, he becomes a diminished cost. And if a lot of people aren't clued up, now might not be a bad time to get a good offer for Alvin Kamara.
That's exactly what I've been saying. If somebody's going to give you 80 cents on the dollar, I think I'm in at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. Just want to cover off very quickly the auction brief. I know you've not done many episodes this off season, but you have done a couple, and it was an amazing podcast that ran through last season. Some amazing guests with, Brian Drake on. You had Matthew Berry. You had a lot of guests on. Phenomenal podcast. Tell everyone about why it's unique and why you're able to get such amazing guests on your pod.
Well, gosh, I feel fortunate to have gotten the guests that I've gotten, and I think a large part of that is that's really helped is making connections through Kings Classic and through the Canton, the Fantasy Football Expo. That's definitely helped. But it is a different format, and when you say tell everyone why it's different, I think there's a couple reasons. Number one is the auction stuff. I don't know any podcast out there that are pushing only auction stuff, except one other one that's some guys from Canada who I really like. Shout out to that to the auction podcast there. But that's one of them. But I also have developed the show itself. When I first started, it was supposed to be a little bit about life and how we navigate life and how we succeed at life and make our way through our daily lives. And I was a little bit scared when I started it up because I didn't want people to leave because they were bored with some of that. But the more I found my legs and found my audience, there's been a little bit more of that. So maybe the first, 15 to 30 minutes of every show, talk a little bit about life and life lessons. And then I throw in some poker lessons in there. And then, we get to general fantasy stuff. We don't just talk auction. My guests talk everything. So we talk general fantasy stuff and hit the auction. So it's really a wide range of topics that we get to. I do think it is unique, and I'm hoping that people enjoy that uniqueness. And I do think it's working because, boy, the show's grown faster than I thought it would. I haven't done a lot of shows in the off season, but we're about to ramp up to weekly shows here in about a month.
Amazing. And it is a fantastic podcast. So please do subscribe. You can find it on all podcast channels and networks and everything else. So do make sure you can and do subscribe, because you're missing out. Even if you're only going to play one auction league this year, it's still packed full of information that's going to help you in other formats, especially the legal updates, especially just some of the strategy pieces. That I love it because I'm a big strategy guy. Like that for me is the most under talked about element of fantasy football. Anyone could tell you what guy to pick. Anyone could tell you rankings and higher and lower, but in-season management is the reason why people win leagues consistently, because it's knowing when to pivot, when to move away from your initial takes with new information, and when to be brave, take risks, knowing who to have on your bench, knowing when to recycle your bench. So I think that's a massively underutilized area. So,
Murf, I want to say thanks for bringing that up, because I appreciate you noticing that. One of the things that I find to be, just like you said, very underappreciated part of this game is that it is a game. And I understand that everybody wants to be the best at evaluating talent. And I was on this sleeper before you, and I picked this rookie before, I get that. And that's fun. And that's part of the fun of it. However, I want to win, And so I'd spend a lot of time talking about how do we win at fantasy football, regardless of the football side of it. I know that sounds weird, but how do we play this game better? And how does that help us get across the finish line for a Super Bowl? Because that's what we're doing here, right?
Yeah, 100%. And I think, I learned a lot of lessons over the last few years, but more so, I finished in the Warrior Bowl. It was 240 participants in his first year. I finished as the runner-up. And again, I love finishing second in big tournaments, as you're kind of getting a feel for, right? Shout out to Steve Perkins, who's in our mock draft group that we do.
Yeah.
He beat me in that. That's how we became good friends, so it was worth it. Not bitter. But I look back at the team that I drafted, and it was one of the worst drafts I've ever done. And I say that hands down. It was one of the worst drafts ever done. I probably, with the exception of Josh Allen, who I took in, I think, the 6th round or maybe a bit earlier, I think there was maybe one or two other players, Alvin Kamara, but I missed so many players. I literally recycled 70 to 80% of the entire roster by the end of the season. I just ruled the wire. I just knew when to take shots on players, when to stock up on handcuffs. And there is a time when you need to do that. You need to have more handcuffs on your bench than you would normally carry, because the greater the long shot, if it comes in. The greater the reward. And when you've got fine margins, especially when you've only got good teams left, i.e. the playoffs,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you stash Dare Ngubawale, that's going to be made into a meme or something. If you stashed him last year, you are, you played him. In fact, he cost me the King's Classic belt because Peter and everyone took him the week before. He wasn't on the waiver wire. That's how you win leagues. Is you win them through. That's not luck. That is the skill element of the game where you see opportunities where handcuffs could play a big part, and you make sure that they're not available to the masses. And that's how you do well. I think it's such an important part. And whilst we're getting onto strategy, we're going to do the auction 102, I've called this. But before I do that, on the bottom of the screen, do have the winners. I did promise everyone JJ Zachariason was on last week, and for supporting him on his endeavor of launching late round fantasy, I said I'd buy 3 guides for the rookie prospect guides. The winners are on the screen at Woodford, at Luke_UKFS, at ABFCJPS. So that's Luke, and James. Congratulations. I'll be in touch. Get your email addresses and make sure you get those tonight so that you've got them ready for the draft. So congratulations to you for winning those guides, and I'll be in touch after the show. So let's hit up some auctions. So we did this episode a year ago, May 31st, June 1st. Make sure you go and listen to that. Just a quick recap, because I want to redo the whole thing. What are some quick tips that people can kind of just as a 101 level, some things that they can do just to get a basic edge in auction drafts, or basic preparation, or just some really simple sort of what I call entry level tips for people who perhaps haven't played an auction draft before and are listening to this for the first time?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of things you can do that can sort of give you what I like to call bumpers on the bowling alley. There's some things you can set up ahead of time that kind of give you guidelines so that you don't just completely go off the rails. One of those things is that I like to come up with, and we're going to talk a little bit about this down the road from some of the questions I'm seeing that we're going to hit here. But I want to just briefly mention one of those things is coming up with exact values for what you want to spend at each position. And I know that sounds counterintuitive to going into an auction and trying to be flexible, but I really think if you're starting out, you want to have an exact number by each position on your roster. And I mean every position. So if you only want to spend $1 on the last 5 spots, that's fine. Go write $1 next to those spots so that and then you have it's a way to, when you're in the heat of the moment and things have just started, and let's say you've already got one of your top guys, and then another top guy comes up and you're like, oh, I really want that guy. And then you look down at your sheet and you're like, I can't spend $27 more than I intended on this player. And then that helps you in the heat of the moment when the blood's boiling and you're excited about drafting to just calm down and go with your sheet. So that's the first thing I'd tell you to do is have those exact numbers. You don't have to stick exactly to them, but you need to have them there so that in that moment when you're like, do I bid? You look down and you say, no, I can't do that. Or yes, what am I waiting on? I should be bidding. That kind of thing. So that's the first thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say is that you really have to take your preparation to a new level when you're in an auction. And the way a lot of people say, well, what does that mean? I say, well, I make this analogy. If you are in the middle of an auction and there are let's talk about 3 different running backs. Okay. So one running back has already been auctioned off and he went for $45. And then you have 2 other guys who have not been auctioned off, but somebody nominates one of those 2. Now those 3 guys are right next to each other, ranked right next to each other. Let's say they're ranked 6, 7, 8. And then the first guy went for 45. Now number 7's up for auction right now. And number 8 still has not been auctioned off. So you've got these 3 guys. The auction demands that you know what you think about all 3 guys. So you have to not only know what you think about all 3 of them, but know how you value them as far as like raw dollar values, but also how do they bounce off of each other? How do you compare this guy to this guy and the guy who hasn't been bid on to the guy who's being bid on, So the relationship between those three, how do you rank them? How do you feel they should be valued? All of that is so much more complicated than it is in a regular snake draft. So what I say is, go down the list and just those guys who are grouped close together, think to yourself, who do I want out of this group and this tier? And compare in your brain, hey, if that comes up at that moment, which guy do I like more? And you're going to have to do that the entire time you're in an auction. So the level of preparation is just much higher. You got to be more prepared. That's just the bottom line. So
can I give you an analogy for this, right? Because I did this last year. Because you're right, you've got to evaluate every single player pretty much, or at least the top 150 players. And I liken this, and you might laugh. I liken this to, when you get some dropouts at your wedding, and you've got to decide who you're going to promote from the evening guest to the main day, and you've got a literal dollar amount. It's like, okay, is that person worth spending £150 or $200 on for their seat? Like, do I like that person enough to warrant spending that kind of money on them? Because that's exactly how you view it. Because your wedding, it's your money, it's your costs more than likely, and you have to make decisions between a group of 5 or 10 people, and it's a case of which one is worth that dollar value. And I find evaluating auction players very similar to picking my guest list at my wedding. When I get vacancies, I have my set list, but if for some reason they get priced out, they go, I need to come up with a backup, and I need to think about who I might need to slightly overpay for, because I really don't want anyone else of that tier. And if so, how much I want to overspend if I feel like I have to. And then if I do overspend, where am I going to allocate those resources? So it is it's a funny exercise, and it's very strange if you've never done it before. But once you do it a few times, it does come to you pretty quickly.
Yeah. And to your point, I think that when you get in there, you'll realize there is a certain point at which you don't want to have a guy in your starting lineup like below a certain point. So you should isolate that ahead of time. You should be like, okay, well, I don't want my RB1 to be below this point. And that really helps you to have almost like a Top Gun reference, like a hard deck. Like you don't want to go below the hard deck for your RB1. So when things are starting to thin out above that hard deck, you got to jump in there. And sometimes you're going to have to pay a little bit more. But isolating those spots at which you say, hey, I don't want my tight end to be below this guy. I don't want my wide receiver 3 to be below this guy. I don't want my QB1 to be below this guy. That really helps ahead of time too. And the other thing I'd tell you that I kind of forgot about, but I think is really important too. When you're starting out, you just need to wait a little while when you're in your first auction. Don't jump in and buy like 3 guys in the first 2 rounds. You're going to be sorry that you did that. Spend some time sitting back. And the great David Dodds said this, and I totally agree. He says sometimes he'll even wait like 100 players in to see what is happening. And I think that's too much. I think it's too aggressive. But I do think that you can go like 4 or 5 rounds and maybe only buy like 1 elite guy and just see how the draft's unfolding. And I really believe that this gives you an advantage when you're just starting out, because you're going to see how the room itself is unfolding before you're diving in with $60 and $70 players.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a mistake that we've all made. And if you make that mistake, or you have made that mistake, everyone I know has made that mistake. I still make that mistake. I did it in an auction draft last year. I panicked at QB. They were running off the board. It meant I had to go the rest of the season without a third QB, and I had to wait, and hopefully someone got promoted from waivers, and I ended up getting Taylor Heineke as a result, and it worked out. Like, luckily, I had Prescott and Allen, and I was like, okay, in a super flex, and I was like, okay, I'm just going to have to eat the bye weeks and just go, okay, well, what happens then is what happens. But that's life. Like, but I shoehorned myself into that position because I let other QBs go off the board and was like, that's fine. And the teardrop was Dak Prescott or Matt Ryan.
Ooh.
And I was like, I'm just going to have to pay up here because, and if I don't get another QB, I don't get another QB. I'm just going to have to take that risk because I can't have Matt Ryan in a super flex.
There's a huge difference there.
Yeah, and it was the right decision because I made the playoffs. I think I made the final or semi-final. Anyway, I went as far as I could go with that team. Whereas if I'd gone with Matt Ryan, I wouldn't have got there because I would not have had the wins. I might have strengthened elsewhere, but it was too much of a gap. And I think that's a really key point: is knowing those thresholds is really key.
Yep.
So going into, I want to go into some deeper strategy now because I feel like the people that listened to this last year, they got a good base. They understand. They've made mistakes. We've talked about some of the things they can correct, and that's great. And they can go back and listen to last year's show, and they can listen to the auction brief. But I want to get into some very sort of scenario-based strategy because I feel like some of this is really key because I find these are probably the most common areas of mistake from, I don't want to say like new players, but I don't want to say overly seasoned players, like that intermediate. You've done a few auction drafts, but you're not like, you've not done 100. And so the first one is around running backs because of the fact that it's such a volatile position and there's so much change. If you get your RB strategy wrong or you're well out on it, you're pretty much done for the year in fantasy football. So in the scenarios, it's sort of 4 schools of thought I bucketed them into. So blowing pretty much most of your budget on 2 elite names. So 2 top 5, 2 top 7 running backs, say. One of them being like your Jonathan Taylor or your Christian McCaffrey, Derrick Henry, etc. Blowing the second scenario is blowing a decent chunk on one of those RBs, and then, but not on both, and then sort of maybe going for like a low end RB2 type is your second, and then you just scale a load of guys in that pool. The third scenario is going for 2 low endish RB1s, maybe sort of high end RB2s, anchoring the position, maybe not getting the upside, but getting a nice safe floor. It's not going to cost you the premium to do so, but at least you've got some solid floor and safe play there. Or just basically the 0 RB, punt the position, spend the money elsewhere, and then just take guys where there's values later on in the draft. And you might get a top guy later on, or you might not. Depends how people spend their money. In terms of those schools of thoughts, and based on your knowledge and experience, and I appreciate this probably changes every year, so this is a very difficult question. Which of those approaches, if you were playing the game, knowing what you know now, and you were getting back into it sort of for the first time, what would be the sort of approach that you would use to kind of anchor your team at this position, because it's such a pivotal position, and why would you choose that as a, and appreciate you're not going to predetermine the strategy because you've got to base it on the room, but if you had to pick one, and why would you pick it based on models' success and probability?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. It does change, but it doesn't change as much as you'd think at the running back spot. Now, it may change a lot more at like quarterback and tight end, that kind of thing on different leagues, but I tend to attack the running back spot fairly similarly in most drafts. I appreciate the fact that 0 running back can be successful in a snake. I don't believe that's the correct strategy in an auction because I think that there is enough deals on the board that you don't have to go completely 0 RB. That's not necessary. I understand in a snake it's different because you're stockpiling all this awesome talent early in the draft at other positions, and then you're trying to hit on running back later. But the auction doesn't demand you do that because you can apportion your money and you can have your cake and eat it too. So I don't believe that 0 RB is right for auctions. I also don't believe that 2 big RBs is correct for auctions either, because like you said, you referenced the volatility, but what it does is it really locks you in to the rest of what you have to do with your roster. And the weird part that I find, and it happens year in and year out, is that everyone values the running back points more than the wide receiver points. And I understand that the scarcity argument, and everyone says that, well, it's because they're scarce and they're more expensive because there's so few guys that are bell cow running backs. And you got to get one of them. And I get all those arguments. I truly do. But it's wild to me that, for instance, last year in the Kings Classic, I got Devontae Adams for $42. Now, all the top running backs were going for over $50 and, up to $60. And I think, well, that's crazy because why should Devontae Adams be a $15 cheaper than one of those top running backs? So I think people get carried away with the running backs. And so the way that I've done it is I think it's the new phrase is now called hero running back that you referenced. I like the anchor. I want to go get one guy, and here's the thing, I am not a advocate of going and grabbing one of the top couple of guys in an auction because I do think that the volatility, for instance, if you paid up for Christian McCaffrey last year or Derrick Henry or something like that, it's not that I think that's a terrible move. It's just that I find it much harder to get a good roster when I'm paying the 60 or 65 range for that top running back. So instead, what I like to do is I like to slide a little bit down the RB1 rankings and hit that mid pocket of right around 5, 6, 7 in that range and get one of those guys. And that worked to perfection last year. Again, just because it worked last year doesn't mean it's going to work again, but it's been, and I'll explain that in a little bit, but I got Austin Eckler last year in the Kings Classic, and that was the perfect spot. It was that perfect sweet spot where I had him, and then I didn't want to worry about the RB2. So I believe at this point, my optimal strategy is, and I talked about this on my show not long ago, and I don't know if you guys know the phrase, the hay is in the barn.
No,
I said, okay, so
I,
the phrase just basically means, hey, that's already done. That's already settled. The hay's already in the barn. Don't worry about it. So one thing I said that I believe the hay is almost in the barn is that RB2 matters less than ever before. And I do not care whatsoever who I have as my RB2. Now, I'm trying to get somebody at a reasonable price. And when I say I don't care, I do care. But my point being, I don't want to spend a lot of money on that. And I had a ton of success last year getting guys at RB2 like Chase Edmonds and Kareem Hunt and those kind of guys that nobody wants and nobody's excited about. You end up with guys like that for like $9 or $11 and that's exactly what I want to do. So I want to go strong RB1, but not the top. So I want to be spending in ideally the $40 to $48 range for an RB1. And then I want to go and just fall off the map on my RB2. And I want to grab somebody who has a role, but who people just aren't excited about, like a Hunt or somebody like that, who might be in a timeshare. And then I'm going to stockpile 2 or 3 of those type of guys. And then I'm going to throw the rest of my money at wide receiver. So to answer your question, I really believe it's an anchor running back. And then I just I play the odds and I try to grab like 3 guys who I think can jump up and be an RB2 on any certain week.
So you're looking at, if we were to equate it to this year's draft, for people who might listen to this like a month or 2 months from now, you're thinking like a Dalvin Cook, a Najee Harris, Javonte Williams, provided Melvin Gordon hasn't been signed. That's maybe Leonard Fournette. They're the sort of guys that you're probably going to target with reasonable. DeAndre Swift, for example, kind of come in that mind.
Yeah, I think that you're exactly right. A couple of those guys, Fournette's going to be a big one for me this year, and it's been wild. I've been seeing Fournette go really late in these snakes. I've not done an auction yet. When I say real, I've done some mocks, but I haven't done a actual like league where people have to start somebody every week and to see what Fournette's going to go for. But I think I'm going to have a lot of Fournette. I'm thinking I'm going to have a lot of a couple of those guys you mentioned. Because, I'm talking like mid to back half of the RB1. I don't really want to go low end RB1. And that's the interesting part about it. I do get a little bit nervous when I get down to that low end because guys like that, we're talking guys that, like Nick Chubb and Aaron Jones, that they have some volatility that I don't want. I want some rock solid, like, hey, this guy's going to get this many targets and this much sort of involvement. And then that's why I feel comfortable being done with the RB2 because I know that there's that rock solid role there.
Makes sense. Next question is around, can you realistically grab a top 5 RB, a top 5 wide receiver, a top 5 quarterback, and still build a competitive roster?
I don't think so. It is certainly possible. But if you're in a group of people that know what they're doing and have done auctions before, I just don't think it's possible because you're talking price tags. Now, a lot of the times, Murph, you and I, we're going to be drafting with other analysts. So they're really going to tank on quarterback. So I think it's a little easier to get a top 5 quarterback in one of those rooms. But in a typical draft room, if you're playing with, your buddies from home and you're going into an auction room, they're going to spend a lot of money on Patrick Mahomes and Lamar Jackson. And they're going to, I think the combination of, say, like you end up having to spend 31 bucks on Jackson, and then you end up spending okay, well, who's a guy that we could talk about? Let's say Derrick Henry. You end up spending 52 on Henry, and then you go for a top wide receiver. Now the wide receivers are a little bit cheaper. Maybe you get them for 45, but you can see what that does to your budget. And I don't know that you can build a really deep team. Your starting lineup may be okay, but I don't know that you can build the team that I want to build, grabbing that much talent. It's fun, and I tell you what, in a 10-teamer or lower, 10 or 8 teams, I think you should be doing that because it's easier to put together the team off the waiver wire, and just the player pool's deeper by the end of the draft to be able to pick up nuggets at the end. But in your 12 teams and up, I just don't think it's possible to do. I'm not saying it's impossible. It's just very, very hard, and especially if you're in a room full of competent drafters.
Yeah, completely agree. Nomination strategy. Now, I find this is something that people just ignore, right? They just don't really focus on it. They either pick a player that they want or they pick a player they've got absolutely no interest in. And that is literally the thought process that is done in a nomination. It just gets thrown away and it's done.
Yeah.
And it's so wrong. So talk about why nominations matter and what are some of the things people should do. And obviously each scenario is different. We're not going to be able to cover all scenarios here, but just to get the understanding of why nominations are so important and some key tips and things that you should try and do with your nominations.
Yeah, I agree, man. It's wild to me because here's the thing I always say to people. I think that really helps illustrate. There are so many things in an auction draft that you cannot control. You can't control when a player gets nominated. Of course, you have your own nominations, but you can't control when your league mates are going to nominate certain players. You can't control how much, your buddy over there is drinking and then he's going to do something wild and spend too much money on a player that you wanted. Or you can't control like, hey, this guy spent too much money on his second quarterback and now he doesn't have a wide receiver. So he goes crazy and spends too much on his wide receiver that you were going to get. Those are all things you can't control. Isolate the things you can control in an auction, and you end up steering the auction more than you think you will. Because, and let's say that it only gives you a 5% edge. I mean, what I talk about with auction strategy is every little thing that you do stacks on top of each other. Okay, so I'm good with my nomination strategy, and then I learn a bit more about reading my league, and then I learn a bit more about how I'm bidding, and then I learn a bit more about how I'm budgeting, and each one of those little advantages stacks on each other. And so what I say about nomination strategy is, you only get a certain amount of nominations per draft. You could look at it from the negative and be like, why does it matter? But I choose to look at it from the other side. That's one of those things that I can control during a draft. Why would I throw that away? Why would I just be like, who cares? I'll just nominate this guy. And that's what everybody does in an auction. I find that 95% of auction players do not have a cogent nomination strategy. So that was a long intro there, but let me just say a couple of tips about it. Number one, I would say later in a draft, I'm really a huge fan of what I call targeted nominations, because you're going to get late in the draft. And if you're a good drafter, you're going to have more money than probably 75% of the league later on in the draft. And what you need to be doing is isolating what the players ahead of you really need and what you don't want, and targeting the nominations to hit those players. So I think one thing that people don't do enough of is targeted nominations. Get some nominations out there that are going to draw money from the teams that you need to draw money from. Not just, hey, everybody likes this guy, I'll throw him out. No, say, okay, there's one guy that's got more money than me. What does he need? And what can I hit him specifically with to draw money from him? That's one way, targeted nominations. The other thing is I tell people I like to make a list of players that I want to nominate and when I want to nominate them during the draft, when I think the optimum time. That doesn't always hold up when you get into the draft, but I may put on here, okay, I want this guy. I'm going to try him in the third round, or I'm going to try him after these couple running backs are gone to see if I can get him cheaper because these guys are gone, or these guys are still on the board, so I can get him cheaper because people are waiting on these two and I can get this guy cheaper. So I have some specific players that I want. And so I'll make a list of those players that I really want and think, how can I maximize the potential when it's time to nominate them? And then on top of that, I'll have a list of players that I know that I can use sort of as weapons later in the draft. I absolutely don't want these guys, and I have to punt because I'm running low on money and I got to punt a nomination. So I go to my other list and say, who can I throw out there that I completely don't want that's just sort of a punt, like a placeholder until I can get back around to my nomination the next round and do something I want.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's something I've been very bad at for a long time. It's something I've started to get a bit better at because you do just want to draw, you want to take money out of the auction that's not yours. And if you can find people with lots of it and you can get them to spend some, they might get the player that too many people are afraid of that strategy because they're like, well, if I know that he's after, let's say we're 10 rounds in and say from last year, Antonio Brown was still on the board. You're like, well, they need a wide receiver too, so Antonio Brown is kind of the best of that. But I don't want to nominate him targeting that guy because I don't want him to end up getting Antonio Brown, and he's got the most money, so he's likely to get Antonio Brown. But he could get Antonio Brown at any point anyway, so it doesn't matter. Like, you'd rather him spend the money now and help you if you're going to compete. You both need a tight end 1 or a tight end 2, or
Well, and let me jump in there and say too that that's a great example because sometimes then it's good to nominate them and sometimes it's good to wait because that's what gets into the psychology of the moment. If you know that they want that player, they're going to save their money for that player because they don't know how much they're going to spend on him. And this happens a lot in super flex auctions. People wait on quarterback because they think, I'm going to get a deal later, but then they're saving their money. They're hoarding their money for those quarterbacks. You can jump into the running backs and wide receivers and tight ends and be scooping up deals while they're over here hoarding their money because they don't have their quarterback yet. So sometimes it's good to leave them on the board, and the person there is going to hoard their money. You're going to pick up deals while they're waiting to jump on Antonio Brown.
There you go.
It can cut both ways.
Yeah, that's awesome. This feeds on nicely to my next question, which is around online tells. Now, a lot of people in the UK are probably going to play their auctions online. That tends to be when most leagues happen. They tend to happen online. Very few live draft leagues. But in terms of maybe if it's people they don't know or people who they kind of know from Twitter, but they probably don't know them that well, what are some of the tells, some of the things that they can look for in an online auction that's going to allow them to get a bit of an advantage? You mentioned waiting and seeing what other people do to gather information, but what kind of information would you be looking for by waiting?
Yeah, the online auctions are they're much more difficult, and I've always said this that I'm good at live auctions. I'm much better at them, but there are some things you can do online. One of the things that I find to be most important, and I know this is going to sound super elementary, but I think it's really important. If you're going into an auction and you're doing this, let's say you're doing it on Sleeper, and you haven't done many auctions on Sleeper, go in there and familiarize yourself with the software, because there's nothing worse than when you're in the middle of a high pressure moment and you don't know where to click +1 or how to type in your bid. That stuff's, it sounds elementary, but you 100% have to do that ahead of time. And if you don't do it ahead of time, then log in the earliest possible moment you can for your draft. So let's say your draft starts at 7 p.m. and the draft room opens at 6:30. Be in there at 6:30. If you haven't had a chance to familiarize yourself, just look around, click on all the tabs, see what happens when you click stuff. Because I know that sounds dumb, but in the pressure moment, you'll make a mistake. And I can't tell you how many people complain to me that, oh, this happened or this happened. And it's just purely a mistake in an online auction room. And that drives me wild. Like, how can you want to compete but not care enough to check this stuff out ahead of time. Those are details, things that drive me nuts. That's number one. Number two is find out what site you're going to be auctioning on and take a look at their pre-draft rankings, because people will be highly influenced by where the site themselves have them ranked. Even if they don't believe those rankings, they're still subconsciously influenced by that. So a lot of times when you're nominating, you can be looking at, well, by the time it gets back around to me, the top guys at each position are going to be gone because people are going to use that site, Yahoo or ESPN or whatever. They're going to use their pre-draft rankings. As far as tells go, I think that the biggest thing that I always say is pay attention to how much people are bidding. And this is a lot easier live, but now with online stuff, it's kind of nice. A lot of the sites have, when you bid, it puts your last bid up there. And so if you were involved in a player, it'll show that you were involved, even if you've dropped out of the bidding. I think it's really important to find which players are really active on the bidding, but are either buying those players or not buying those players after being active. And that's really important, because you can tell, hey, this guy's just jumping in and running the price up and then dropping out when he doesn't want them. Or, and this goes for live and online, do they nominate them and then end up with them at the end? Or do they nominate them and then just stop bidding? I mean, there's not a more glaring tell than somebody who nominates a running back, like a good running back, say like Aaron Jones, and then they don't register a single bid. You know that they don't want that player. And you can tell them later on, is that all that they're doing? Maybe they're nominating a guy and never bidding on him. That's just what they do. So those are things that you can tell live or online by looking at their bidding history as each player comes up. So I like to have a little notepad next to me. And all the players, I like to say, bids and never wins anybody, or, only nominates players he wins. I'll make little notes about this guy was super active early and then, just dropped out and didn't do anything, that kind of stuff. I'm taking notes the whole time. And the last thing I'll say, I know I've been rambling a lot here, but
That's good.
The last thing I'll say on online stuff is a lot of people believe that if they let the clock run down to 1 or 2 seconds and then hit their bid, that's somehow going to discourage you from then bidding against them. Like, hey, this guy's never going to give up. And, oh, I almost had him. And then he bid with 1 second. And then they think you're going to get frustrated and give up. I don't know that works, but pay attention to the guys that do that, because almost assuredly when they do that and they let the clock run down, it's not because they're hesitating. It's because they want the player. So I think that's a pretty strong tell online too.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it ties in a little bit with actually another point where you talk about tactical nominations. Is I like to keep an eye on when people, especially in the UK, you always get periods where people go inactive and they end up on auto.
Yeah.
And it always happens because people aren't used to the 3-4 hour drafts that can happen in an auction. So sometimes I play possum, and knowing I'm not going to bid on anyone, go on auto just to make people think I'm really disinterested, when actually I'm at a point in the draft where I'm quite happy just to sit and watch and get some information. But inversely, there are players who just go, I just need to check out for like 20 minutes. And you can tactical nominate and be really careful to stick them with players that they really don't want and clog their roster, because it's unlike, they only get X amount of players. So you could clog them with players with tactical nominations.
Yep.
Where if they're on auto and it's a position they need, it will auto bid them to a certain level. And if you know the pre-draft rankings and there's not that many players left, especially towards the end of the draft, you can stick players with players that aren't any good because they're on auto.
Yep. I love it.
So it's definitely a great strategy point there. I think, online auctions are hard, but I think, as you said, notepad, loads of notes. And I like to write down. I wrote a chapter in the Fantasy Football Playbook last year about what are some of the things I can find out about people. What team do they support? The amount of people that put their avatar as their favorite team is hilarious. It's like, okay, so you're a Buccaneers fan. Okay, so you're going to like Tom Brady, Mike Evans. So I know when all those players, they could be, might not. It's not surefire, but they might be willing to bid a few dollars over. the rankings for those players. If you're playing with other analysts, look at their rankings. That's always a good one. I like to do that, listen to episodes where they do rankings or whatever. But just anything like that, where you can go on their Twitter, see what players they like. If they talk about fantasy football, who are the players they're following? Who are the analysts they follow? If they follow certain analysts, go look at their rankings. Go pull them. Go see who they value. If they follow you, Drew, I'm just going to pull your rankings. Just make
Believe
sure.
me, I've been hearing that.
Just have them near me. So I think that's it's definitely some advantages that you can have to make that work. Conscious of time, because the Dynasty guys do start in a couple of minutes, so want to make sure we get over to them in time. But lastly, before we go, just want to say thank you so much for coming on, Drew. It's been an amazing hour. Love to have you back before the start of the season. Maybe we can do an auction league for some of our listeners and they can play with you. Perhaps we can try and make that work at some point this summer. I'd love to do that if it's okay with you.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Hit me up. I'm always available. Like I said, I'm taking until mid to end of May off, going on a vacation with the family, recharging for the 3-month stretch run.
Amazing and well deserved as well. Tell everyone where they can find you, where they can find the pod, where they can find all your work with Football Guys and everything else.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the chance to do that. Check out my podcast called The Auction Brief. You can just search that anywhere you find pods. And like I said, I'm on a bit of a hiatus right now. I'll be back in a little bit, but I'm loading up the big guests this summer. Dave Richards coming on, Marcus Grant, Josh Larkey, some of those guys. And so we're loading up guests right now for that. The Auction Brief pod on Twitter at Drew Davenport FF. And then now I get to plug my TikTok. So head over to TikTok, the Fantasy Football Lawyer on TikTok, and check me out there. And all my writing is on Football Guys. And I'll be dropping 12 to 15 auction articles minimum this summer over on Football Guys.
Amazing. So go check that out. Go check out Drew at Drew Davenport FF. Thank you so much for coming on, Drew. Really appreciate you, buddy, and look forward to doing more drafts this summer with you for sure. Rush Nation, don't go anywhere. In just a minute, literally 1 minute, Liam and Rich are going to be here and they're going to take you through some amazing Dynasty content. So please don't go anywhere. Just switch over the video on the channel and please give them all the love and support because they're putting out great content. And so until actually Thursday, got a very surprise guest in episode to celebrate draft day. So tune in for that one. But as always, Rush Nation, don't forget, keep rushing.